Okay, this is my video on GitHub and continuous integration and continuous deployment, just to kind of give an idea of how that works and how you set it up and kind of how it works. I actually started this video before and I kind of had these slides where I was going to describe this stuff, and that ended up becoming a really long video. So I stopped it, and what I'm going to do, if you have, I'll include a link to this stuff and you can look at it. If you have any questions you can ask, or if you care to know or whatever. So with that in mind, I'm just going to jump right into the demo and show how you set up continuous integration and continuous deployment, and how that works. So the first thing I'm going to need is basically a web app environment to work with, and I'm going to use Azure. I know we do on-prem, even though we shouldn't, but okay. So I'm going to set up a web app on the internet hosted in Azure Cloud Platform as a Service. I just select web app. I have a resource group. I'm not really going to explain a lot of what I do because it will take too long. If you do have any questions, let me know. So I'm just going to make this Sheely demo, something really, because this will simulate like a test environment where people would go test this app and whatever. It's code, not I'm not doing Docker. That Windows, yep. I want it in Central US. I want a new plan. Sheely demo plan. This is the SKU. I don't need a production level site. I just need, this is for development and testing. And if you were doing dev and test at Kador and we were using the cloud, this is, you would choose one of these environments. I'm just going to pick a free one, and that generally is all you need. Monitoring you normally want, maybe not in a test environment, but I'm just going to shut that off. This is going to validate my settings, and it's going to then create and provision that website, and that usually takes a couple of minutes. So I'm going to let this run, and what I'm going to jump into is the next step, and that's what I'm going to build a simple app that we can use to show this CICD process working with. And I'm just going to go into Visual Studio. I'm going to create a new app, and I'm going to use Blazor. Blazor is actually going to be the standard application model for .NET Core with Microsoft going forward. Again, that's kind of a whole nother discussion, but I'm basically just going to go through here. .NET Core 3.0, yep, Blazor, this is all good, and create. And what's going to happen is this is going to, just create my app. It's going to put in some kind of starter template, hello world kind of stuff in there. Just takes a couple of seconds here. It's going to restore the NuGet packages and a few other things. So this is what we'll start out with. I mean, the application's kind of irrelevant for this example, but let's just take a look and make sure it works, and we have something to work with in this demo. And it's building, it succeeded. Now it's going to open up the browser here, and we'll get our little dopey application. And this is it, just kind of some starter little stuff to have something there. Home page, a little counter thing, and some fictitious weather forecast stuff. So, okay, we got an application to work with. So, the first step is I need to get this into source control, and we're going to use GitHub. And that's really pretty easy to do. Just add source, or add to source control. I want Git. So it's going to basically add all that code into a Git repository, and then it's got it queued up to push. And this down here in Visual Studio is kind of your Git version control things. Like this is changes that need to be pushed up to your host or your origin. These are changes locally. This is the name of the app and what branch you're in. So we're using GitHub. I'm going to use my own GitHub account for this demo. I'm just going to call it CICD demo. We're going to make it a private repo and we're going to publish. And it's out there. So I'm going to go into GitHub, which actually that website we provision, it's now out there. Again, I'm not going to really I'm not going to really explain this stuff because it just take way too long. Not that there's really a lot to it. It's actually really simple. So this is my website that's on the internet in Azure. And this is basically kind of a coming soon kind of thing because I have my site there, but there's no code really loaded in it. So that stuff's all ready to go. So I'm going to go into my repositories and my account, and I have a bunch of stuff that I've played around with or demos that I hold on to for like if I need to look at them later on. But this is my repo that we just pushed. I'm going to do a couple of things. You can give it a description. What I also like to do is put the website, if it's a website, maybe a desktop site. In that case, you wouldn't put a website in here, but you could just put, what app does, and then, the website. And I usually take out the transport. I just put the URI on here. You can also put the website in here. And then there's also a thing, in other kind of things, they call it tagging, where you can kind of put in custom tags. They call it topics in GitHub. So you could do something like maybe the department. So we could say, DMV. And then maybe this is also a movers application. And then, this would be something we would have to agree on as an agency, like how we use these tags, because if everyone's using different tags, it's not going to really help. And basically where that helps you is, if you have an organization with a lot of repos, or someone like me that's got a lot of junk out there that it may be hard to sift through, I could actually say, okay, I want all my DMV stuff. And then all those that have topics or tags of DMV shows up. Or maybe I want movers. And that's how it can kind of narrow it down. I can also put, that website. Maybe I know the website, but I don't know what code it's associated with. Well, this can help me find it. And then usually if it's code you work on a regular basis, I would star it, and that kind of puts it in your favorites. So when you come into GitHub and you want to look at something, it's like, okay, this is something I normally work on, and here it is. So now, normally what we would do is build code on our own machine. We would deploy it from our own machine. Well, we want to set up continuous integration and continuous deployment. That way it's all automated, it's consistent, and there's other steps we can put in there to like testing and stuff like that can be added. So what I'm going to do is set up my build and release definitions so that I can have that CI and CD process in place. Normally you would use GitHub Actions, which is in GitHub itself, which is basically allowing you to set up the same thing I'm going to do, but I'm going to do it from DevOps, because actually GitHub is owned now by Microsoft, and so it's really the same process. And I'm just using this because I'm really familiar with this. And if I used GitHub Actions, I'd have to stumble and bumble my way through it. So I have DevOps, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new build pipeline. And it's really, you just kind of step your way through it. I want, it's coming from GitHub. And basically it's going to list all my repos. I want my one that we're working with. And now this is basically asking for authentication from Azure DevOps into GitHub. And it's like, okay, yeah, fine, go ahead. And this is basically linking those accounts together so that GitHub and DevOps can work together. And this also, you would maybe do this if you want to use the agile tooling that is in DevOps. You also could link that together. So I'm just picking my account. It's basically going to authorize it. And now it's finishing with this kind of wizard process. Well, this is a .NET Core application, so I'm going to select this. And the way your build and release definitions work is they're created in what's called YAML files. YAML files are kind of a popular format for, kind of this step-oriented execution, step-oriented type processes. And it basically gives you this right out of the box when you start it. I'm going to make a few tweaks. I want this to be triggered not only by changes or pull requests that are going into my master branch. I want it for any release branch, no matter, and that's a wild card. So my v1.1.0, or if I get to the point where it's like version 2 point something, any change in that branch or pull request that goes into that branch is going to trigger this to happen. Now only you need to really add, and actually your build steps will really probably be the same from app to app to app, because it's really nothing specific to that code. It's really just, I want this specific build process to happen. So there is two more things I need to do. And these are kind of like a wizard plugins that create the YAML for you. And I need to add one more step, which is after this is all built, I need to save those build artifacts. I need to publish them. And you just accept the defaults. I just say add, and it adds that step. Basically in the steps, what it's going to do is it's going to prepare the NuGet packages, it's going to do a build, it's going to run any unit testing if you have it, and then finally publish those artifacts. I do need to update that test step because it's not quite what it's supposed to be. And this is just going to be a copy and paste. And so now I've got my build pipeline set up. I'm going to save it. And this is actually going to save that YAML into my master branch with my code. And I'm going to say save and run. And so what's going to happen now is it's saved that build definition, and now it's actually running for the first time the build. So what's happening, how this all works is, and this is where you get that consistent, reliable, and secure build. It goes out, and what happens is they have, if you're familiar with Docker and containers, Microsoft has build images, or images for build agents. They're always kept current, they always are patched, they always have the latest updates. And what it does is it takes that image, spins it up into a container, it injects your source code along with the steps needed for the build, and then it runs it in that container. And it's a single life, single use container. And when this one build is done, that container gets vaporized, it gets destroyed. And what you have in here is you're basically watching the various steps of that build definition happen. And it's into the build part right now, and your build is usually the longest step. And we'll just kind of let this finish out, and this will be our first build. So everything succeeded. I got one warning. I could look at that, and I can tell you it's just because there's no tests. and you should do unit testing. And I'm going to add one later to show you how setting this up helps keep the integrity of your code. Because if I checked in code that was broke and wouldn't build, or the unit test didn't pass, it's not going to make it past this step, and I'm not going to get that bad code into my code base. So I now have my one build definition. I actually have one build that completed. So now I'm going to do my continuous deployment, the CD part of it. That was the build. This is the release, the deploying it. I don't have any pipeline set up, so it's basically the same kind of process. It's going to come up here and say, where do you want this to go to? Now this would be a little bit different because we're on-prem. So actually this part would probably not, you really wouldn't even be doing this part. What you would end up doing, because if you're using on-prem, after that build would happen, you'd go into the build and you can say, I want to look at the artifacts in this drop folder. And what you would do is you would download this to your environment. And if you open that folder, this is the compiled code. And it's kind of buried deep in here, but you have to keep, I didn't want to click on that. And we're almost there. Here is the actual code that you would put on, like out on the folder for IIS. But we're doing the cloud, or we should be going to the cloud. So I'm going to go into my release folder, or release definitions. I'm going to create a new pipeline. I am going out to Azure. It's an Azure App Service deployment. And basically you just kind of go through the setup here. It's like, okay, that's good. This is where I'm basically going to connect this to my Azure account and that app service that I built, that empty web application that's sitting out there. So I want my subscription. It's going to authorize it. It's going to have me sign in. And then what will happen is, once it's finished authorizing, those websites that I have, and I have several on there, are going to be listed in here. And I want, this is where it's going to be going to. So I'm going to save that. This is where where it's going to save this definition. I just want it in the default. I could add comments. I'm not going to do that. So that's now where it's going is now set up. So let me go back in here to my new pipeline, or edit it. So I got this part. This is like where it's going to. Now I'm going to give it a better name. I'm going to call it test environment. I think that's spelled right. So what triggers this to happen, or what's the input to this? It's going to be a build. And it's this build. And basically, again, you just take the defaults. I want the latest build to trigger this. And that's really it. I'm not going to do it, but there's things that you can set up for pre and post deployment. This might be where you might set up things like emails that go out or whatever. Probably the main thing you may want, and this is for like production environments, you can say pre-deployment approvals, where maybe you put in a supervisor that has to approve this before it actually gets put out to the production environment or a test environment. Maybe the testers or the business unit has to approve this or whatever. I'm not going to set that up for this, but that's kind of a common one. That's that way there's kind of control and people know when things are going to production or certain environments. So that's really it. So I can save it. I don't really need to give it a comment. And I now have my release definition out there. And it's never been ran, but I can trigger it to run. I can say from that release definition, create a release. And it's just going to basically run this release because I already have a build that's happened. So basically what's going to happen is it's kind of similar to the build process. I can go in here and I can watch the steps as they happen. And it's, again, the same kind of process. It's creating spinning up a container from that agent pool. It's going to connect, and then it's going to start running my steps, which are actually, there's not really too much. It's just basically dumping it and shipping it to Azure. So, so great, everything succeeded. So that means I now have on that app that I created in Azure, I now my CICD process has now pushed that code out to this environment. When I refresh it, I'm going to have that little wonderful, amazing website. And there we go. So basically, I now initially have this stuff out there in the cloud. My CICD pipeline's in place. So what I'll do now is kind of simulate how the process would work by making a change. And then that change will trigger all that CI/CD process to happen. And this way, developers can just focus on developing it. I don't have to worry about how does the code get to what environment. Maybe I don't even know what environment, how to get onto that server or app service in Azure, whatever. So what I'm going to do is kind of use the tools at GitHub. And so what I'm first going to do is GitHub has its own issue tracking management that you can use, or maybe you decide to stick with Work Tracker or whatever works. I'm going to just kind of show you how this works. Again, I'm not going to get into too much details. I want to keep this demo as short as possible. So I'm going to say I got a new issue. Let's just say I want to add a privacy page to this app. And I could put in descriptions. I could even take screen prints and copy it in here. I could drag and drop files or whatever. I am going to assign it to myself. Labels kind of describe what the issue is, whether it's a bug, documentation. You can add your own labels. I'm just going to say this is an enhancement, and it's a real simple one. So it's like a good first time issue. And this could maybe be for, if we had beginner developers, this might be something they would look at like, oh, okay, I'll start out with this. Or if you're an expert developer and you got nothing to do, maybe you're choosing to do this or whatever. So now I have this issue out here. And the idea is, me as a developer, I would be checking these issues and saying, oh, I think I'll work on this. And it was also assigned to me, so that's another good reason to work on it. So what I'm going to do is, and this may be part of an agile project, or maybe we work on a team where we're doing regular deployments. So this change is going to be part of a release, and there's probably going to be other changes that would go into that release too. But in this example, I'm just going to do this one change. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a release branch. And that release branch is what will be built out and will go to the test server, so that then the idea is users test it. So I'm going to create a release branch. And typically you name it release, and then like maybe we're on version 1.0 and this is the next version, so we'll say 1.1.0 because you usually follow that major, minor, and revision numbering system. So the notion is, and just quickly to show this, and this is two ways it can be done. This is more for like a simpler app where maybe only one developer is using or in the code. This is more like if you have a team or you're doing agile or something. Basically, from my master branch, I created a release branch. And I'm going to do these features, or different developers are going to do these features. And when they're done with the features, they're going to do a pull request to merge that into the release branch, which then triggers all that CICD process. And if it passes, it'll move on to our test server, which I set up in the cloud. So I create my release branch, but I want to do my work in a feature branch. So I'm going to create another branch off of master, and I'm going to call that feature privacy page. So now in GitHub, I've created, I actually now have 3 branches. I have my master branch, which you never want to be working out of that. My feature branch and a release branch, which will be my fix and change and maybe other changes. That will be constantly being rolled into here. And when that all tests out, that gets then merged through a pull request into master, which then means it goes out to your production system. So I'm going to skip back to Visual Studio here, and I'm going to do my change. I'm going to make my change. Now I'm on the master branch. So what I want to do is I want to do a pull so that I get all the changes for master and that metadata for other branches that exist out there. It's kind of like the equivalent of a get latest in VSTC, the version control in TFS that most people in our group are using. So I can now go in here, and this is the branch I'm in. Well, I don't want to work in master. I'm going to click manage branches, and oh yeah, here's my feature branch. Now what I want to do is change or check out and go into that branch. So I'm going to check out. And what that does is it changes me out of master and puts me into this branch. Now the code will be identical because I haven't made any changes. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to add that privacy page. Just a simple little change to demonstrate how this works. So I'm just going to copy this index page, paste it in, and I'm going to call it privacy. And I need to change my routing. And I can just say, privacy info here. And I'm going to say privacy. Now I'm going to do all these titles on these pages are using H1s. I'm actually going to change this to an H4 so I can kind of show you how that review process of a pull request happens. That maybe, okay, the change is okay, but you need to make this different, and I'm going to use that for an example of this. So I also need to put this privacy page on that side menu. And I'm going to do that by duplicating a button, just the last button. And this href is to that routing statement, so I need privacy as the route statement. The button text will just say privacy page. This is the icon. Not going to worry about that. So let me run it and make sure it works. And it's building and it's running, and here we go. So I now have all the stuff that was there before, and then I have this glorious privacy page. So as a developer, I'm like, okay, I'm done. Looks good to me, works. So what I need to do is now commit my changes, take my changes on my local repository and push that out to GitHub. And these are my local changes. I changed those 2 files, and I'm going to say as a description, added privacy page. And this is where I can, that issue, I can link my commit to this issue, which is issue number 1. So I can say issue number 1. And that number 1 basically is it linking it to that. So I'm going to commit the changes on my local repo and then push them out this branch up to GitHub. So it committed it. It's now pushing that outgoing commit up to GitHub. It only takes a little while. It's all done. So now when I go out to GitHub, and I can actually do this in Visual Studio. Since Microsoft owns GitHub, they're now making it to where you can pretty much do everything without going to the GitHub site in Visual Studio, but I'm just used to doing it this way, so that's the way I'm going to do this. But there's kind of multiple ways of doing the same thing. So GitHub's actually reminding me or showing me, hey, you have a change out here. It's kind of triggering that to say, hey, you want to do a pull request? I do. And normally what you would do is just click on this. But let's say for some reason you came in several days later, or I don't know, this wasn't there. You can just go into the pull requests tab. And it's also here as well. But I'm going to say this is how you would do it if this shortcut wasn't there. You just say new pull request. And what I'm wanting to do is take my feature branch and push it into the release branch. And then that will trigger my continuous integration and continuous deployment. And so what I'm wanting to do is my feature branch, I now want to go to that release branch. And basically this is just saying, can it merge it automatically? This is where if you had merge conflicts, they would show up. That's kind of another discussion. And me as a developer would say, okay, yep, here's my pull request. Let me create it. And I can put more information about it. I can drag and drop stuff. I can add reviewers, whatever. And I'm going to create that pull request. So now what's going to happen is, and you could set up in GitHub so that the people that are to review that get alerts or notifications, or it could just be that people will review this pull request tab on their own. Now, this demo is kind of different because I'm doing all these steps back to back to back. Normally, this might transpire over the course of hours or days. But the notion is I'm doing these steps all in a row, so it's to show you this. But the notion is other developers, or maybe the PM, the program manager, or team lead, or whoever's designated to look at these pull requests, or the team as a whole, they would come in here, and the idea is, okay, I see a pull request. And what you have now is there's this continuous integration happening. And what's happening is when I created that pull request, it actually triggered a build of that branch. And the reason it did that was because if I had introduced something that broke the code, it would fail in here and not allow it to go through. And that's how, like I've worked in tax center where it's like you do a get latest and it's broke just right out of the box. It's like it won't even build. This kind of stuff prevents that from happening. Now I don't have any breaks in my code, so it went through. And so the idea is People would review the code. I could look at it and say, okay, well, it passed all the checks. And if it didn't, then obviously that needs to be fixed. And this can link you out to where that build was. But let's say the team is then reviewing the pull request. It's like, okay, well, at least it passed the continuous integration check. So I'm going to go in here. Okay, there's some changes. And it's like, okay, this looks fine. I viewed it, looks good. But oh, that H4, that should be an H1. So I, as a different team member, I'm simulating being a different team member. I'm saying, well, this needs to be an H4. And GitHub kind of has these review tools built in. So I'm going to say make H4 and H1. And I'm starting this review process. And the notion is then me back pretending to be the developer that made the change. And if it's set up, I could get an alert, an email saying, okay, there's a message out here about your pull request. And I would come in here and say, okay, what's going on? And I can look at this. Actually, let me do this. Okay, here it is. I didn't go down far enough. So, and this is kind of just a linear, as messages come in, it just goes down the page. I can say, oh, this person, which is actually me, but it would typically be somebody else. Oh, I need to do that. Okay, I'll make it an H1. So I go back to my code and I go to the page and I say, okay, easy enough. Let me run it, make sure it builds, because we don't want to check in broken code. And I always want to make sure my change has really happened. So I go, okay, yep, looks like it's an H1. So now I'm going to check that in. I'm going to stop the app. I'm going to say, here's my change. And I want this to be part of, again, that feature, which is going to end up being part of that pull request. So I'm going to say, and I can put in here anything I want, or 4 to. I'm going to say commit and push. And it's going to push that up there. And then the idea would be, and this is a little bit different because I'm kind of talking to myself, so this doesn't really display right. If it was two different actual users, this would look a little bit better. But I would say, okay, made change, or whatever. I'd probably put something a little bit more descriptive than that. And then the notion would be what's going to happen is that change has now triggered that CICD, or that continuous integration process, because I want to check that code. I want to make sure I'm not putting junk into the code base, that it can actually build. If I had unit tests, which I don't, that all the unit tests are passing. But the notion is the person that made that recommendation, would get an email if it's set up that way, or maybe they just come back and look at this. I'll show it later, but you can actually integrate GitHub into Microsoft Teams so that you can actually get alerts and stuff inside of Teams, like PRs and issues, and I don't have it logged in, but I can show that later. So the notion is whoever made that suggestion comes in and they look at it, and like the first thing you might look at is, okay, it passed continuous integration, so nothing inadvertently broke. But here's where I made my comment. or I said made change, and I can say look or looks good merging or something. So I make that comment, and then I'm done with this conversation. It's that issue's been resolved. Um, the changes look good, so now I'm ready to take that feature and I'm ready to merge it into the release branch. And what I'm going to do is this kind of completes the process because everything's been reviewed. Continuous integration says everything looks good. It didn't fail any tests. I don't really have any tests. And I'm going to do a squash and merge. I'm not going to explain why, but well, I mean, it's nothing really complicated. It just takes those two commits and makes it one commit and moves it into the release branch so that the history kind of is cleaner and you don't have all these extraneous commits. But typically this is the option you would take. This is just saying, do I want to confirm that? I do. And actually, now that I've pushed that branch in there, I don't really need it anymore. And usually in Git, you don't really want your branches around forever. And since I'm done with this, I'm going to delete it. I don't need that feature privacy page branch. I'm done with it. So that completes that pull request. And what's actually happened is that feature branch has been now pushed into the release branch. Now, what's happened is, again, any changes to those branches trigger the continuous integration and continuous deployment. So when I go over here and I go into the builds, that's actually kicked off a build, which also does all that continuous integration testing. It's doing that all over again because, again, it wants to make sure that that branch builds out correctly. So let's see, it's now in the build step. And again, as developers, you're not going to be in here watching this. The only reason I'm doing it is because I'm doing all these things in a row back to back. Normally it would just take care, it would happen over several hours or whatever, all these different steps, and you really have no reason to watch this stuff unless it failed. So my build completed. So now that's triggering a release, or it's going to trigger a release build. Sometimes it's not instantaneous. Let's see what's. I might have did something wrong here. Okay, I forgot to do this part. When it ran the first time, I manually kicked that off. I forgot to come in here and do this trigger. And this is, I need to enable this. And I need to enable it on what branch? This is my test branch. So I want that to be release star. Any release branch, I want to have it trigger this deployment. I'm not really going to put any comments. I don't care. I can close that. So I may have to do a build again to trigger that process. So I can actually make that build happen again. I can just queue it. But I want this on my release branch is what I want to run this pipeline on. Now, normally you wouldn't do it this way, but this is how you can manually run a build. So basically I get the fun of watching this happen all over again. Now, while it's happening, I'll say this. The part of your GitHub account, you get so many hours of compute time or build time. And I can't remember what it is. I think it's like 100 hours a month. And then if you go past that, it costs so much per minute or hour or something. But I can't remember the specifics of that. But so this is building. And we'll let this finish. It's getting close to being done. Almost done, and now it's finalizing the job. So now if I go over to my release branch, it may take it a couple of seconds here. It's now kicked off a release because it was triggered by a successful build of that release branch, or any release branch really. And so kind of like the same way it's starting up a build or a release agent, and it's a lot simpler of a process. It's basically just pushing that stuff out there, and it's almost done now. So we'll let this finish, and that's it. So it finished the release, and if I go out to this website, my Sheely demo test site on the internet, it's now deployed that new version. This is kind of a thing to do with Signal R and Blazor. I'm not really going to explain that, but I'm going to reload it, and this is out on the web. So as you can see, I now have that privacy page, and this is and that's pretty much the CICD process and using GitHub. I probably not the best video in the world because I kind of went over it really fast, but it kind of gets you an idea of how that works. And usually you're not going to be in here watching all this stuff happen. I was just doing it for the sake of the demo. But that's pretty much the entire process. So at this point, that's really it. I am gonna. You can stop watching now, but I'm gonna do a few other things to kind of show some other stuff with continuous integration and continuous deployment, and some other kind of basically just some other stuff around CICD. For instance, I'm going to show what happens. Let's say, someone checked in code that's broke, and how does the CI/CD process prevent that from happening? So I've deleted that branch. So let's go into GitHub and say I'm just going to create another branch and call it a new feature branch. And I'm going to call it feature, call it broken, because that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put some broken code out there. So I'm going to work on that branch. So I'm just going to close this stuff. So what I need to do is switch to that branch. And again, it doesn't know that branch exists. So I'm going to do a pull. And it actually failed. Actually, that's because that branch doesn't exist anymore. So what I actually want to do is I'm going to switch over to master, or I could switch to any branch really, but I'm going to switch over to that branch, and do a pull. So I get that metadata and information about other branches that are out there. And so now I've got this feature called broken. And I'm going to check out into that. And actually, since that privacy page, it'll take a while and this will fall off of here. But I could actually delete that branch because I'm off my local machine because I just don't need it anymore. So it's gone. But I'm now in this broken patch. And what I'm going to do is simulate like, okay, I made a code change and now it broke the application. So I'm just going to pick a page. Let's go into that fetch data. And I'm not going to get into Razor or Blazor and Razor syntax, but I'm just going to put something in here in this code block that breaks, like just something like that. I mean, if I actually try and build it, it's not going to work. It's not going to build. It's not even going to run because I got build errors. Now let's just say somehow or some weird way I committed that code. Like I didn't check it to even see if it works. I'm going to say made code change. Commit the code to my local repository and push it out to GitHub. So that's now completed. I go to GitHub, and this actually lists it here. So I'm going to take the shortcut and say, yeah, I do want to do a pull request. And I want to put this in, this is like a different feature I might have been working on. So I want this to be part of that release branch. I want this to go out to test so users can test it. But what you're going to see is, because this has that break, our continuous integration process is going to catch that and say, I don't think so. So I, as a developer, I don't know what I'm doing, putting in this bad code. I created my pull request. Then the idea is the alerts go out, or at some point in the day, a developer comes in and says, oh, we got a code change here. And I go in here and it's like, okay, it looks like it's running continuous integration right now, actually. So I could, if I wanted, I mean, by the time the person actually would come in and review this, the step is probably already completed. But just to look at it, here's my build. And actually this build is going to fail. When it gets into this build part, it's going to blow up. And it's like, uh-oh, we got problems. That don't look good. And it skips the rest of these steps. And, I mean, the job finishes, but you got errors, which isn't good. So I, as a developer or the team lead or something, maybe I come in, later, maybe it's even the next day, and I come, oh, here's a pull check or pull request. I need to check it. And I go in here. The first thing I'm going to see right off the bat, wait a minute, that don't look good. And I could get details, which really just takes you over to this and would show you the same information. And this is where I'd say, I would tell the person, fix your crap, or something a little bit more PC correct. I'm gonna make that comment, and then me as that developer then and I don't have it set up to do this, but I would have gotten an alert like, hey, a change was made in your pull request. And I'd get in here and I'd look at the conversation, and like it would say, fix your crap. And I'd say, oh, that isn't good. My project didn't build. What the hell happened? And I could get in here, and this is basically the build messages. And here's where I could actually, it's actually going to say what the errors were. And it's like, oh, in this pages, in this fetch data razor page, what's this goofy command? I don't get it. Whatever the hell happened. And it's sometimes these line numbers don't always match, but I would then go into my code to that fetch data razor page, and down here, and yeah, it's actually line 44. Like, oh man, I accidentally did something. That ain't good. I'm just going to delete it. My change, I'm going to say I fixed my crappy code. Sorry, dude. Probably not what you'd want to put in there, but what the hell. So it's going to push that again up to GitHub. And then the notion is, you know, after I push that up there, I would go into the pull request and I would, you know, put something in there like I fixed it. Now what I might want to do is wait till continuous integration actually verifies that it does build, but we're just going to assume it does. I wouldn't do that in real life, but we'll just say I fixed it. And then the notion is, you know, the person that was reviewing it later on would come back and check. And like if I came in here and I was the reviewer, like, okay, this means it's in progress, but we'll go in here and take a look. Okay, continuous integration is going. I'll, you know, what I'd probably really do is go off and do some other work and then come back later. But let's watch this build. So, and also it has, you know, the kind of obvious green check, okay, bad, and this is in process. And I could see where I am in the where I am on the in the build steps. So good. Looks like that build worked. I fixed my screw up. So then, as a reviewer, you know that I was that reviewer. I've done, you know, some other work and maybe went to lunch or whatever, and I come back and it's like, oh, okay. It built. That's good. So let's just review what they did. Actually, the funny thing is, because I just removed that one little line I put in, it actually shows no files changed, because technically I just reverted it back to the way it was to begin with. But the idea is I'd still review that, and maybe there's some changes they still have to make. But in this situation, I'm going to say no, and, you know, there's really actually no change. But I'm just going to go ahead and say, yep, push it through. I don't need this branch anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. And that closes out that pull request. Now technically I didn't really make any changes, so I don't know if it will have okay. Technically there's really no changes because I removed the one change I did, but it's now now it's merging that code into the release branch. And what's going to happen is it's going to do this whole process over again to make, to run all the tests, to make sure the code's good. But then it will follow with that second step of it'll then trigger my release build to happen to send that out to my test environment. So we'll let this finish, and really there'll be no change whatsoever because I really didn't do anything other than add a line to break it and then remove it. So it's going to trigger a release, or it should. Might take a second to show up here. So now it's queued this release of my test environment. Now I'd probably also have in here a production environment, maybe a QA environment, all my different deployment places. I just have this one defined for now. So it's in progress. Again, this one goes pretty quick because all it's really doing is pushing code out, even though there's really technically no changes. It is pushing that code out again. So, I'm really just where I was to begin with. So, one other thing, I don't have